Um, okay, there she is. So thank you for giving me a little of your time this afternoon. My name is Fern Sakamoto and I work at Nagoya University of Foreign Studies. I'm teaching intercultural competence courses and English writing courses there. And I'm also pursuing a PhD. I'm around halfway through a 6-year slog of a part-time PhD, and I'm doing that through Macquarie University in Australia. And I'd like to talk to you today about some of the very early findings from the first part of some research connected to my PhD. And that's looking at this whole idea of gurobaru jinzai, or global human resources in Japan, and trying to pin down what that actually is. So I think people who come to the Lakeland conference usually have a fairly solid grounding in what's going on in Japan related to global competence development and things like that. But just in case, over the last 15 years or so, the government has been launching a number of global projects, and they're aiming through these to internationalize the universities in Japan, and also to encourage universities to cultivate gurobaru jinzai, or these globally competent graduates. And my own interest in this came about because I was employed by a university as part of their Go Global Japan project. And I was tasked with creating non-credit extracurricular courses that students would take theoretically, and that would make them globally competent. And so I really had to start off by very quickly getting a grip on what that meant and what I needed to be teaching these students or helping them to learn. And so I looked into global competence and gurobaru jinzai and intercultural competence. And the more I did that, the hazier the picture became, and the more it seemed that there wasn't really a great deal of clarity or agreement about what we should be aiming for, particularly in the Japanese context. Now, the government, at the time that I was looking at this, provided this description of gurobaru jinzai, and there's been, there are some others floating around. I think they're all fairly similar, and they're all similarly vague. But there's always this focus on language ability. It's usually phrased as foreign language ability. At 99.9% of the time, that means English as a foreign language ability. And this is kind of where people tend to hone in, because this is the easiest part to understand, the easiest part to measure. The second factor that they describe here is talking about traits and attitudes that seem desirable for global competence. And then the third, they talk about an understanding of other cultures. And there's almost always this focus as well on retaining Japaneseness. And that's kind of something we see in Japan that we don't necessarily see as much in other parts of the world. Now, despite quite a lot of investment on the side of the government into these projects, it's kind of questionable whether they're really effective or not. There are those who say they're not. Yonezawa and Shimi talk about a persistent tendency of young people in Japan to be inward oriented. Burgess, this is a little old now, but he talks about the tendency of the whole nation of Japan to close in and to reject global norms. And it could be that the projects are not effective. It could just be that we're not really on the same page, perhaps about what we are aiming for, or how we know if people are actually globally competent or not. And so this is what I wanted to look into a little bit. What actually should we be aiming for? I think Katsumata sums up the problem or the situation in Japan really nicely here. This is my own English. I may have taken some liberties, but this was the vibe that I got from Katsumata's words. What the heck is gurobaru jinzai anyway? What kind of people are we talking about? We don't even have a clear definition to start from. And so this was kind of the starting point for my PhD research. Now, of course, there are many frameworks. So why don't we just pick one of those? Why do we need to redesign the wheel? I think there are a couple of potential problems with what's available. One being that there are a lot of frameworks that seem to have just popped out of thin air, especially the things that we see on university web pages, for example. It's really unclear whether there's there's any sound research going on that's producing the framework. And then in the situation where there are, really there has been some really solid research done. Most of those frameworks are coming out of the West. They're coming out of America, they're coming out of Europe. And so they're assuming Western cultural norms that, and I feel like that might be problematic in Japan. It might not be, but it's a question worth looking at before just kind of picking a framework and saying, okay, this is what my students need to have. This is what I need to aim for. And so I wanted to investigate what global competence looks like in Japan. And these were the two questions that I came up with. I just realized I forgot to set my timer. We'll see how we go. Somebody let me know if I reach 22 minutes or so. So I wanted first to kind of have a look at what stakeholders, so people who are involved, students, teachers, researchers, people who have global work experience in Japan, what these people think students really need in order to be globally competent. And then the second question comes out of my own background as an educator. And I just felt like it would be really valuable to me to know which of those aspects are particularly challenging for students. And in my own case, foreign language learners in Japan, as those are probably the areas that as an educator, I can support them in and help them along the way. I decided to use the Delphi technique. This is something that has been used by some of the, I guess, more well-known research created frameworks for intercultural or global competence. Hunter used the Delphi for his global competence framework. Dierdorf used it for her intercultural competence framework. And it's really just a way to facilitate group communication and help a group of people hopefully make a decision or move towards a decision. And what it actually involves is participants respond to questions and then continuing to rank and refine and narrow down their ideas over a few rounds of survey questions, and hopefully ultimately to arrive at an answer, or perhaps answers is more realistic, I think, to the research questions. And so a Delphi study always has these three features. The participants, they don't see each other, they don't know who else is involved, and they don't know who is saying what. There's iteration, right? They address the questions, they get some feedback so that they can see what other people are saying. They have a think about that, then they have another go at addressing the questions. Right? And this takes place over 2, 3, 4, 5. It's up to the researcher, obviously, to decide how many iterations there are. So my own methodology is a modified Delphi. A Delphi study has 2 phases. The first is exploratory. And what happens here is there's a generative round. So this is where we generate all the possible answers to the research question. So for my first question, what is global competence? What do students need? Maybe there's going to be possible answers like they need to be willing to communicate. They need language skills. They need curiosity. So the first round is about just gathering all of those answers so that they can then be explored and evaluated later in the process. And there are 2 ways to do this. One is a literature review, just picking all of those different ideas out of the literature. That seemed like a bad idea for me because there's not a lot of literature addressing the actual nature of global competence in Japan. So, I'd be introducing a Western bias right from the start. The other way is to just ask people, ask stakeholders what they think. And in a typical Delphi, the exploratory phase and the evaluative phase are carried out with the same group of people. In a modified Delphi, that initial round is separate from the Delphi panel. And so that's what I chose to do. I used a questionnaire because I wanted to hear from more people. I figured that gave me a better chance of really hearing all of the opinions, or as many as possible of the opinions that existed as a starting place. And so once that information has been gathered and coded and made, organized, then you can really begin the Delphi proper and go through these steps of rating and ranking and clarifying and narrowing down all the possible answers. And so today, this is where I'm sharing about this area. I've completed data collection, but I haven't completed analysis, and I didn't want to give you a sort of a half result from the Delphi stage. So I'm looking at the wider perspectives and the, I guess, initial responses that came out of the questionnaire. So I developed a questionnaire using focus groups. At the start, I wanted to get some ideas about how people might react to different use of terms. If I talk about global competence or gurobaru jinzai or intercultural competence, different ways of asking questions. So I got some feedback, and then I designed questionnaires that essentially ask you two main questions. The first was, what is important for students in Japan to be globally competent? Please think of skills, abilities, that's the same thing, knowledge, attitudes, these kinds of things. The second question asked them to list what they thought would be particularly challenging to develop. And I implemented it online. It was a bilingual questionnaire, and the participants could kind of toggle between Japanese and English, and it was anonymous. So these are the people who kindly responded. These are the 4 groups that I was really interested in talking to. So I limited participation to these 4 groups. You can see the researchers were not so keen. I think often the researchers and the teachers are the same people, so that was probably bound to happen. But the teachers were all teaching foreign language at university in Japan. The majority of them spoke English as their first language, and most of them were teaching English. 60% male, the other 40% identified as female, and they were mostly in this age bracket. The students all turned out to be English language majors. I was looking for language majors. They were all English language majors. 98% of them had Japanese as a first language, 3/4 were female, and they were all in the same age bracket. The researchers, the small number of researchers, you can see there the divide between first language. There were a couple of people who spoke a different first language. Again, 58% male, the rest identified as female. They were mostly a little bit older than the other participants. And the workers, these are people who have experience working inside and outside of Japan, or they grew up outside of Japan and now they're working inside Japan, or people who are working in Japan with in very multicultural workplaces. And all of these were self-identified. They chose the category they thought they belonged to. And you can see there some of the statistics for that group. So what I did with their responses, I used content analysis. At first, I just looked at what was there and tried to pick out categories, make a tentative coding scheme. And I kept those Japanese and English answers separate. I didn't want to translate those too early and miss nuances. I came up with a coding scheme, and then I went back and I used Atlas software to code all the responses. I still kept Japanese and English separate here. And at the third round, I went through again, I eliminated things that really were the same code. I merged codes where the Japanese and English seemed to be saying the same thing. And then I took a look at what I had, and I needed a way to organize it because I still had hundreds of codes. And so I went back to the literature and found, frameworks that were already out there that really matched what I had and gave me the terminological clarity that I was looking for to kind of separate my groups into categories, separate my codes into categories and create a big picture. So the findings that came out of that in response regards my first question, this was the actual exact question that I posed. These were the items that participants most frequently talked about as being necessary for students in Japan to be considered globally competent. And far and away, the most frequently commented on aspect was foreign language ability, which is probably not surprising to people in Japan. But looking at the bigger picture, a lot of the frameworks that are out there don't even include a language component, especially things coming out of Western contexts where it's just not something that needs as much attention. Participants also talked a lot about openness, and openness here, based on the model that I used to kind of separate out these traits and attitudes. It includes things like open-mindedness, curiosity, creativeness. These all kind of come under this heading. And then we had knowledge next. People here were talking about really knowing and understanding how people live in different parts of the world. So these were not very surprising. The third was communication. This is also in the majority of models for global competence. I did separate communication and language. I intended to whack them together initially, and then I saw some answers like TOEIC score. And I thought, okay, well, that's language and it's not communication. So I've kept them separate. No doubt there are people who say language, they're thinking of that in a communicative way. What was interesting to me was the attention that was paid to these particular traits. Okay, so here, this is a lot of information. Here we're looking at, on the left side, the main factors that people were talking about being important. And then on the horizontal axis, you can see the percentage of each stakeholder group who were talking about that. So depending on the color. What I've circled here, this is the students who were talking about extroversion. So while overall it wasn't, one of the top 3 or 4 responses, for students, this is 1, this is 2, this was their third most frequently commented on aspect of global competence. They thought this was really important. Teachers, on the other hand, let me just give you an example. This student's talking about having the courage to actively speak out. Right? This kind of thing was what they tended to be talking about in this extroversion code. And the teachers were quite likely to focus on emotional stability. But if you look at what they're talking about, it really looks like the same thing, right? The students talked a lot about, I need to talk more, I need to be bold and brave. And the teachers were saying they need to have the confidence so they can talk more and so that they can be bold and so that they can be brave. And so I think these really are perhaps talking about the same thing, and they certainly feed into each other. Sorry, I jumped a little early there. I'm going to come back to that point. If we look at the findings to the second question, which was asking them about the challenges that Japanese university students face, on the same illustration here, I've shaded the areas that a lot of people talked about as being problematic or somehow hindering students' development of global competence. And the number 1 here again was a focus on foreign language skills. But the kinds of comments that people were making were talking about the ability to actually use their foreign language skills. The focus wasn't on proficiency, it was on using what they had to actually achieve communication. And again, there was a lot of attention over here, the extroversion and emotional stability. And again, it was the same kind of tendency of students to be talking about, we need to be more extroverted. Researchers were also quite high, but remember there are only 12 of them. So it's easy to have a high percentage of researchers. And teachers, again, were really focused on they need to be more confident. And the kinds of comments that reflected this, so this student is talking about having the ability to actively say your opinion, and this teacher is talking about having the confidence to, probably do the same thing. So it really looked like, from the responses and the ways people were talking about these items, that emotional stability was at the center of it all, that the teachers were talking about students really need confidence so that they can be more extroverted. Students were saying the same thing, they just started here. And the idea that, having this confidence then feeds into speaking out more, using the language skills to communicate, being more willing to try new things, to engage in communication. It really seemed to be at the center of what a lot of people were talking about. Now, there were also some external hindrances that were given quite a lot of attention, and I sort of didn't see that coming. I should have. So there was some focus on the domestic culture in Japan as perhaps a barrier in itself. And here this person's talking about a lack of environments, I guess, or a lack of household and environment and education and societal situations or places that really value diversity, difference. The educational system came in for a little bit of a bashing, both at the classroom level and at the institutional level. And there were quite a lot of people who just said the students don't see enough diversity. They don't have enough exposure. And that is the main block, was what a lot of people were saying. So overall, what I saw coming out of this, this preliminary exploration was a suggestion that we can't ignore foreign language ability in Japan. We can't just bring in a model that completely omits that when so many people are so focused on it. It is an important factor, whether we like the emphasis on English or not. And its role in effective communication is really deeply connected to emotional factors experienced by the students. They really, it really comes down to having the confidence to speak and to use those language skills. And so what that means, and I'm kind of coming from a foreign language educator perspective here as I'm thinking of the implications of that, it really seems like foreign language education does seem like an appropriate place, one of the best places maybe to target this development of global competence, and we need to think about how we can do that. This is a fairly old refrain, but again, people were really saying we need to focus on more practical foreign language skills. And I think what seems to be at the center of all of this for me is that I really need to take time to appreciate the need to build the confidence, to mitigate the anxiety, to help students to be comfortable enough to use the language and achieve all of those other things that are seen to be necessary for global competence. I'd like to leave it there. Thank you, and hear comments or questions if you have any in the perhaps 1 minute that I have left. Thank you.